For thousands of years, empire after empire has swept across the Armenian Highlands, each one leaving its own mark on the region's politics, religion, and culture. Scientists reveal the genetic origins of Armenians, and the DNA was unexpected. Armenia sits in one of the most fought-over, empire-crossed regions in all of recorded history, caught for thousands of years between Persian, Roman Byzantine, Arab, Mongol, and Ottoman power, each one sweeping through the Caucasus at some point across the centuries. Given that history, most geneticists expected Armenian DNA to show extensive mixing with practically every major population that ever passed through the region across these long centuries of shifting rule. Instead, when researchers finally sequenced the Armenian genome in detail using large-scale genome-wide methods, moving well beyond earlier, more limited marker-based approaches, and compared the resulting data against the historical record, they found something almost nobody predicted going into the study: a population that formed through an ancient mixing event thousands of years before recorded Armenian history even began, and then remained remarkably, almost stubbornly genetically isolated for roughly 3,000 years afterward, essentially unaffected by nearly every empire and invasion that swept across the surrounding region in the millennia since, decade after decade, dynasty after dynasty. To understand why this finding surprised researchers so much, you first have to understand the geography and history that Armenia actually sits within. The Armenian Highlands occupy a mountainous region in the South Caucasus, wedged between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, bordering modern-day Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. This location placed ancient and medieval Armenia directly along some of the most heavily contested trade and military routes connecting Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, meaning the region experienced an almost continuous sequence of conquest, occupation, and shifting imperial control across thousands of years of recorded history, generation after generation living under one changing authority after another. The Achaemenid Persian Empire controlled parts of the region in antiquity. Alexander the Great's conquests swept through the wider area, reshaping the region's political map for generations to come. The Roman and later Byzantine empires fought extensively for control of Armenian territory for centuries, trading dominance back and forth as the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern political order shifted around them. Arab conquests reached the region in the 7th century, bringing with them significant political and religious upheaval across the wider Near East. Various Turkic and Mongol invasions followed in the centuries after that, each one leaving behind its own mark on the region's political landscape. And the Ottoman and Safavid Persian empires later divided control of Armenian territory between them for hundreds of years, leading into the modern era, a division that shaped the region's political fate right up until the 20th century. Given this extraordinarily turbulent history, involving so many different conquering populations moving through the same relatively small geographic region over and over again across multiple millennia, the reasonable genetic expectation going into this research was that the modern Armenian population would show extensive genetic mixing from many different historical sources, a genetic record reflecting the sheer number of different empires and populations that had passed through, settled in, or fought over control of the region across recorded history. This is exactly the pattern researchers have documented in many other historically contested regions around the world, where repeated conquest and settlement by outside populations gradually reshapes the genetic composition of the people living there over the centuries, layer by layer, with each successive wave of outside settlement typically leaving behind at least some detectable genetic trace within the broader population. This question matters for reasons that go well beyond simple historical curiosity. Armenia holds a distinct place in world history as one of the oldest continuously identifiable ethnic and cultural groups anywhere in the world, with written records, a distinct language, and a distinct alphabet developed in the early centuries of the Common Era, along with the historical distinction of Armenia becoming the first nation in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion in the early 4th century. Understanding the genetic history underlying such a long documented continuous cultural identity offers researchers a genuinely rare opportunity to compare deep genetic history directly against an unusually well-preserved historical and linguistic record, a combination that is considerably harder to find in many other parts of the world, where written history is often far less continuous or far less well-preserved across comparable spans of time. Armenia's linguistic history adds another important dimension to why this research mattered so much to the broader field of historical linguistics as well as genetics. Armenian occupies its own distinct branch within the Indo-European language family, a family that also includes languages as geographically distant as English, Hindi, and Persian, all ultimately tracing back to a common ancestral language spoken thousands of years ago. For a long time, historical linguists debated exactly how and when Armenian split off from this broader language family and settled into the specific region it occupies today, since Armenian shares certain features with Greek and other languages to the west, while also showing significant historical influence from Iranian languages to the east. reflecting Armenia's position at a genuine crossroads between different linguistic and cultural spheres for thousands of years. Genetic research offered linguists an entirely independent line of evidence to test against these long-standing linguistic debates, since a population's genetic history and a population's linguistic history do not always align perfectly, but can sometimes offer mutually reinforcing evidence when a language and a genetically distinct population appear to have settled into a specific region during roughly the same historical period. The first major genetic study to examine this question in real depth was published in the mid-2010s when a team of researchers analyzed genome-wide data from Armenian populations and compared it systematically against a wide range of other populations across the Near East, the Caucasus, Europe, and beyond. Their goal was to determine both how the Armenian population originally formed and how much genetic mixing had occurred within that population across the many centuries of documented historical turmoil the region experienced afterward. What this research found regarding the formation of the Armenian population was itself a significant finding on its own. Rather than tracing back to a single ancestral source population, the genetic data showed that the population ancestral to modern Armenians formed through a mixing event involving multiple distinct ancient populations, including groups connected to early Near Eastern farming populations who had spread agriculture across the region thousands of years earlier, alongside populations connected to the ancient Caucasus region specifically, and additional ancestral components connected to populations further east toward the Iranian plateau. This mixture did not happen recently, in relative terms. Researchers were able to estimate that this specific ancestral mixing event, blending these several distinct ancient populations into what would become the genetic ancestral base of the modern Armenian population, occurred sometime around 3,000 years before the Common Era, placing it firmly within the early Bronze Age, thousands of years before Armenia's written historical record even begins. Understanding how researchers arrived at this specific ancient mixing model required a combination of methods. Since no ancient DNA had yet been recovered directly from Bronze Age skeletal remains within Armenia itself at the time this particular study was conducted. Instead, researchers relied primarily on statistical modeling techniques applied to modern Armenian genomes, comparing them systematically against reference populations believed to represent, as closely as currently possible, the deep ancestral source populations involved. This approach allowed scientists to reconstruct the most likely ancestral mixture underlying the modern population, and to estimate roughly when that mixture occurred, based on the specific pattern and length of ancestral DNA segments observed in the genomes of people living today, since these segments break down and shorten at a fairly predictable rate across successive generations, following an admixture event, giving researchers a genetic clock of sorts for estimating how long ago a specific mixing event likely took place. Subsequent research incorporating newly available ancient DNA from skeletal remains found across the wider Caucasus and Near East region has since helped refine and further support this original modeling, adding direct ancient genetic evidence to what had initially been reconstructed primarily through statistical inference from modern populations alone. This finding alone was already significant, since it meant the genetic foundation of the Armenian population was considerably older and more anciently established than many researchers had previously assumed. But the truly unexpected part of the research came next when scientists turned their attention to what happened to the Armenian population's genetics after this ancient Bronze Age mixing event across the many centuries of well-documented historical turmoil that followed. Here's where the results genuinely surprised the research team. Rather than finding evidence of extensive, ongoing genetic mixing continuing steadily across the following millennia, in line with the region's well-documented history of repeated conquest and imperial control by numerous different outside powers, researchers instead found that the Armenian population appeared to have become genetically isolated at a specific, identifiable point in history, and remained largely isolated from significant further admixture for roughly the following 3,000 years, essentially up until the modern era. Using genetic dating techniques capable of estimating roughly when a population's admixture patterns effectively stopped changing significantly, researchers placed this shift toward genetic isolation at approximately 1,200 years before the Common Era, a date that falls within the broader period of upheaval across the ancient Near East, sometimes referred to by historians as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period marked by the widespread disruption of major civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. This specific date carries an additional layer of significance that researchers found genuinely striking once they connected it to Armenia's own traditional historical narrative. Armenian tradition and legend has long traced the origin of the Armenian people back to a figure named Haik, described in traditional accounts as a legendary patriarch who led his people to settle in the Armenian Highlands following a great conflict, with traditional dating placing these events at roughly the same broad historical period identified by the genetic research as the point when the population became genetically distinct and isolated. While researchers are careful to note that this connection should not be treated as direct scientific confirmation of a specific legendary figure or narrative, since legendary traditions and precise genetic dating operate on fundamentally different types of evidence, the rough alignment between when Armenian genetic isolation began and when Armenian cultural tradition places the founding of a distinct Armenian identity is a striking coincidence that researchers have found difficult to entirely ignore, and one that adds an intriguing layer to how this genetic finding connects with Armenia's own deep cultural memory of its own origins. It is worth being careful and precise about exactly what kind of evidence this represents, since the temptation to treat this as definitive proof of a specific legendary figure is exactly the kind of overreach that responsible science communication needs to avoid. Genetic dating techniques of this kind carry a meaningful margin of error, often spanning a period of several centuries in either direction, meaning the specific date researchers estimated for the onset of Armenian genetic isolation should be understood as a reasonable statistical estimate rather than a precise, pinpointed calendar year. Likewise, traditional dating for legendary figures like Haik comes from much later written sources, composed centuries after the events they describe, and historians generally treat such traditional chronologies as reflecting cultural memory and later historical reconstruction rather than precise historical record-keeping in the modern sense. What can be said with genuine confidence is narrower and more modest than a full confirmation of the legend, namely that independent genetic evidence places the formation of a distinct, isolated Armenian population within roughly the same broad historical period that Armenian tradition itself has long associated with the founding of a distinct Armenian identity, a genuinely interesting convergence between two very different types of evidence, even without treating it as literal proof of any specific narrative detail. It is also worth comparing Armenia's case against other regions that experienced similarly turbulent political histories, but produced very different genetic outcomes, since this contrast helps clarify exactly what made the Armenian pattern so distinctive. Regions such as the Balkans, Anatolia, and parts of the broader Levant experienced comparably long histories of shifting imperial control across similar timeframes. Yet genetic research on many populations within these regions has generally documented considerably more extensive genetic mixing occurring across these same centuries, often correlating with periods of significant settler migration, forced population resettlement, or large-scale religious conversion accompanied by intermarriage, processes that, for reasons researchers continue to investigate, appear to have played a comparatively smaller role in shaping the Armenian population, specifically across the same broad historical period. This comparison does not suggest anything unusual or exceptional about Armenia in a mystical sense, but rather illustrates how a specific combination of factors, including social and religious institutional continuity, meaningful highland geography, limiting large-scale population movement, and forms of imperial governance that did not typically involve extensive settler colonization within Armenian territory specifically, combined together over many centuries to produce a genetic outcome that, while not unique across world history, remains comparatively rare among regions that experience this particular degree of sustained political upheaval across such an extended time frame. And researchers continue actively debating exactly how much explanatory weight each individual factor deserves within this broader combination. It is also worth noting how this research connects to a broader pattern researchers have observed studying other populations with unusually long documented histories elsewhere in the world. In several other cases, where researchers have been able to compare genetic isolation timelines against independently documented historical or legendary founding narratives, similar rough alignments have occasionally emerged, suggesting that at least some traditional origin narratives, even when their specific details cannot be taken as literal historical fact, may sometimes preserve a genuine folk memory of a real, identifiable demographic event, even across enormous spans of time separating the original event from when that tradition was eventually recorded in writing. Armenia's case, connecting a Bronze Age genetic isolation event to a traditional founding narrative passed down across roughly 3,000 years, stands as one of the more striking examples of this broader pattern found anywhere in current population genetics research. This is ultimately why the genetic origin of the Armenian population turns out to be so much more layered and so much more scientifically significant than most people would expect from a region primarily known internationally for the sheer number of empires that fought over control of it across recorded history. Armenia's population carries within it a detailed genetic record stretching back to an ancient Bronze Age mixing event involving several distinct ancestral populations, followed by an extraordinarily long period of genetic isolation that persisted with remarkable consistency straight through nearly every major empire and conquest that swept across the wider region in the 3,000 years since, a genetic continuity that stands in striking contrast to the turbulent, ever-shifting political history recorded across that exact same span of time. If this kind of story, tracing a population's DNA back through both ancient formation and thousands of years of surprising genetic continuity despite constant political upheaval, is exactly the sort of mystery that fascinates you, this channel exists specifically to uncover stories like this one, sitting at the intersection of ancient history, human migration, and modern genetic science. Subscribe so you do not miss our next investigation, where we trace another population whose DNA carries a genetic secret that took researchers years to fully piece together. And if you found this breakdown interesting, let us know in the comments which population or region you would like us to investigate next, since these comments genuinely shape what we research and bring to this channel going forward, and help us decide which population story deserves a closer look next. And if your own family history connects back to Armenia, whether within the country itself or through one of the many diaspora communities scattered across the world following the upheavals of the past century, it is worth appreciating just how remarkable it is that a genetic thread connecting you back to that Bronze Age population, thousands of years before Rome, before the Byzantine Empire, before the Ottoman Empire, before any of the powers that later fought over the same land, has survived largely intact all the way down to you, carried quietly through countless generations who lived through some of the most turbulent, violent, and rapidly shifting centuries in all of recorded human history.